Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, March 14th, 2021. I forgot to mention this morning. I almost said I forgot to mention this morning. Happy Pi Day. It's 3.14. Very obvious reason why it's Pi Day. But today we're going to be talking about one battleground state in particular. I'm sure you could tell by the thumbnail that this is the state that was the closest to the overall presidential popular vote on the national level. So looking at our numbers, we see that Joe Biden won 51.3% of the vote in the 2020 election on the national level, reflecting nearly 81 million voters, more than that actually. Donald Trump winning 74 million voters, a little bit over that, with 46.8% of the vote. And, you know, ultimately that brings us down to a margin of 4.5%. When you actually get down to a couple of rounding errors, I think it brings us to a 4.4 point margin. So it's not too bad. 4.4% is not at all. That's larger than Obama's victory in 2012 percentage-wise. So looking at the popular vote, we needed to find a state that closely reflected the popular vote on the statewide level. And, you know, previous elections actually were much closer to the popular vote than, at least closer with the state that was reflecting the popular vote. So, for example, we can look at 2016, where we saw that Donald Trump was able to win the state of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, Florida, all those states, right? But he couldn't capture Nevada, which actually was decided by 2.4%. Well, coincidentally, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1%. So that was a difference of roughly 0.3%. In 2012, that state was also not Nevada, but a state that has turned tides to the Democratic Party now. That definitely wouldn't be considered this the same way. The state of Virginia, and it also was the same in 2008. It was also the state of Virginia. And this year, I'm sure you could tell really briefly when I flashed the state for a moment, it's the state of Michigan. Now, when you look at this margin, you would say, you know, this is one of the closest states. How is this at all reflective of the national popular vote? Well, like I said, there was not a state that actually entirely reflected it, even within a percentage point. The closest thing besides Michigan is Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which was decided by a margin of 6.5 percentage points. So when you look at that versus 4.4, 4.5, you see a difference of around 2 versus 2.1. This difference here is only 1.6%, 1.7%, depending on if you want to round or not with the national popular vote. But overall, it's not that large of a difference, and it's the closest state to the national numbers. And I want to do a little bit of an autopsy onto this state because it could reveal some trends that we see on the national level, considering that it is the state out of the three, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that trifecta right there, that voted for Donald Trump the least in 2016 and then voted for Joe Biden the most. I think it certainly has something to offer in terms of sort of an explanation as to why the Rust Belt turned away from Donald Trump and why the entire country as a whole practically did. So let's do a little bit of history about the state of Michigan really briefly, just talk about the state's electoral history. The last time a Republican won the state of Michigan was in 1988. It was won by 7.9% by George H.W. Bush. Since then, it had been a Democratic stronghold. In 1992, it was won by Bill Clinton by 7 points. In 96, it was won by 13 points. Got very close in 2000. Actually, not close. I think it was closer in 2004. Won by 5 points in 2000. In 2004, it got closer, decided by 3 points. Then 2008, it took a complete turn to the left, 17-point margin of victory for Obama. 2012 goes to Obama by 10 points. But then here comes the dramatic shift. We're talking decades leading up to this moment. Donald Trump flips the state of Michigan to the Republican column. But then once Joe Biden's on the ballot, it goes back to the Democratic Party and is the largest margin of victory out of the three states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that's a little bit of a historical recap about the state. But looking at it, you know, what you notice is that there's a lot of red. There's a lot of red on this map. If you look at 2016, look at the county map, they don't do the shading. There's a lot of red. A lot of red. And the reason for that is because the Democratic Party no longer has some of these victories that they had previously. Let's take a look at 2008. That year where Obama won the state by 17 points. Look at this county map. Look at the county map. Wow. Isn't that something? Let me go ahead and show you 2020. A year where the Democrats still won the state, but not nearly by as much of a large margin. Well, here's our county map in 2020. Looks redder? Let's go back and forth. 2008, 2020. Both Democratic victories, both with Joe Biden on the ballot, but very different coalitions. For a reason. The state has taken a turn to the left following 2016, following Donald Trump, to be exact. But it also was the closest state that Donald Trump had carried in 2016. You find all of the states that Donald Trump won. He won Michigan by the narrowest amount. He won it by just 11,000 votes out of over 4 million cast. So it certainly was one of the closest states. It actually is the closest state besides the state of New Hampshire, which was decided by a mere 2,000 votes and a 0.3% margin. It was exceptionally close. Michigan was decided by also 0.3%, 0.27% to be exact. But Donald Trump still was able to win it by a larger percentage than Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire. So it wasn't officially the closest state, but it might as well have been. And, it didn't actually reflect the national numbers back in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1 and lost the state by 0.27, 0.3% to round up. So we're talking about a difference of 2.4%. Well, now, Michigan actually isn't too far off in terms of that. 2.4% versus 1.6%, 1.7%. It's not too dramatic of a difference. But looking at its history in 2016, I think that we found some very interesting numbers as a result of these polls that were taken immediately after poll closing. One thing that you might notice is that white voters, amongst the racial breakdown, is that white voters voted against Hillary Clinton 57-36. Black voters voted for her 92-6. Latino voters 59-38. Overall, non-white respondents, 80% voted for Clinton, 17% voted for Trump. But the problem is that 75% of these voters were white voters. And that was ultimately what blocked Hillary Clinton. That was her problem in this state where Obama had previously done very well. She lost. And that very well region was white voters, not minority voters. In fact, Hillary Clinton did better than Barack Obama amongst minority voters in many regions, including the Rust Belt. It was just the turnout wasn't there, and white voters turned away at a very large rate. Well, fast forward to 2020, what changed? How does it more reflect the national average than it did in 2016? Well, white voters also took a change. Only 55% of them voted for Donald Trump in 2020, according to this exit poll, specifically in Michigan. That's a decrease from 57% in 2016. 44% of white voters voted for Joe Biden. That is also an increase for Hillary Clinton and therefore a decrease for Donald Trump. 36% to 44%, that is a super significant gain. Part of the reason could be Trump crossover votes. On top of that, lack of third-party prominence. What we saw was that the Green Party got a larger margin of votes than Hillary Clinton won the state. We saw the Libertarian Party, triple that. What we saw was that there was third-party alternatives, and rather than them going to Donald Trump in 2020, it seems as if all of them went to Joe Biden on top of some Trump supporters from 2016. White voters also made up a bigger portion of the electorate this time, 81%, according to this exit poll. And black voters actually backed Joe Biden by roughly the same amount, 92-6, just a slight improvement, very slight improvement for Donald Trump. I had said that his improvement would be marginal, but we actually saw it a little bit more of a significant shift in Latino voters. Trump went from being down 21 points to just being down 11 points. Sorry about that, stumbled over my words. But looking at that, that's something that we saw on a national level, a national shift specifically amongst Latino voters that hindered the Democratic Party's chances. But I think that Michigan is an excellent state in terms of the national demographic groups and the national shift in terms of certain minority groups, in terms of white voters. We see it here. We see it clear. And it's not just this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the gender breakdown. Okay, let's go up and take a look at this. Let's see if we can find male versus female. Right? Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton by 12 points amongst male voters. This time, he defeated Joe Biden by just 10 points. Female voters backed Joe Biden by 14 points, only backed Hillary Clinton by 11 points. So we saw a difference here. We saw Joe Biden outperform Hillary Clinton, specifically amongst male voters and female voters. I mean, it was just a double whammy here. And you would expect Hillary Clinton, as the potential first woman president, to actually win women voters larger than Joe Biden. That simply was not the case. And it looks as if that Donald Trump was able to win the majority of those age groups. We're talking about every single one except for 18 to 29. And when you look at 2020, let's go ahead and see if we can find the age here. What you notice is that they broke it down a little bit more. It wasn't just as solid as they had it before. But what you see is that Joe Biden was able to win every single demographic group except for one. He tied in another, but pretty much, Donald Trump only won one age group, and that was 30 to 39. And I think this is actually a region that was least affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Not old enough to be high risk, not young enough to be completely following, I guess, their parents' views, to be in college, to be at a certain point, straight into the workforce, not as risky to go back to work. So I think that we saw a lot of people in this age group actually turn away from these stay-at-home orders in ways that, otherwise they might have been Democratic voters, but now they aren't. They might have been, in a sense, radicalized by the COVID-19 pandemic in favor of the right wing because, to them, it wasn't as serious as it was for those 65 plus, and it wasn't as serious for those students who are at home with their parents, for those college students that are on campus that are being shut down. They weren't directly affected other than the fact that they know they didn't have their job, that they couldn't enter into the workforce, or they couldn't continue working in person, even though they weren't as high risk as others. So I think that's also something that we need to take a look at on a separate video. It definitely is worth exploring the blowback of the COVID-19 restrictions, specifically amongst this age group that is typically reliant for the Democratic Party, because it really doesn't make sense that older voters are backing Biden more than younger voters. But again, we're talking about a completely different circumstance in 2020. In 2016, it was different. Amongst age group voters, we actually have the similar breakdown here. Hillary Clinton wins 2 groups, Donald Trump wins 4. This time, Donald Trump won 1. And this is also something that we saw on the national level. What you see is that rather than these older voters backing Donald Trump by large margins as they did in 2016, 51 to 47, 52 to 44, 51 to 43, what we see is that Biden was able to either tie or win amongst these groups. And it largely had to do with COVID-19. When you saw these people arguing that Trump was downplaying the severity of the virus, what you have to realize is these older voters kept that in mind when they went to the voting groups, when they went to the polls. And, looking at the margin here, Donald Trump actually improved amongst the 30 to 39 age group, but decreased amongst every single one. Looking at the difference here, it was still 2 points. But what we saw was that looking at that, it just seems as if Joe Biden was just able to win over the Jill Stein voters and then nothing else, right? So looking at those numbers, I think that's very interesting. But looking at how this reflects on the national level, I think that it does match what we were expecting. Older voters were going to back Biden in a larger margin, or at least back him in some instance more than Hillary Clinton because of COVID-19. And as a result, that puts the Republican Party at a position where they can't win, because the Republican Party isn't winning white voters in this election by as large of a margin. They aren't winning white voters in Michigan by as large as they did in 2016. They aren't winning older voters as much as they did in 2016. And Michigan is the perfect example of this happening, because it is the closest to the national numbers, and we see the shifts happening in all the right places compared to the national level. A drawback in minority support for Joe Biden, incremental amongst other groups, specifically amongst Latino voters. And then a drawback for Donald Trump amongst white voters, crossing over to the Democratic Party amongst older voters that felt Donald Trump was not taking COVID-19 seriously, reliable GOP voters that turned away simply because they thought that Donald Trump was mismanaging the virus. So looking at Michigan, it was one of the first Rust Belt states to be called, I think, besides maybe even Minnesota. But looking at the margin here, or actually, I'm not going. Called obviously after Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, but those were not really competitive. They were not decided by less than 5 points. Minnesota wasn't either, actually. So Michigan was the first out of the 3 to be called. Joe Biden won the state by 2.8%. And looking at the comparable numbers to the national numbers, I mean, it just makes sense. It makes sense. And if you look at the 2018 results, this is 2020. If you look at the 2018 results, there was sort of a warning sign here that the GOP wasn't winning in the Senate race, or at least wasn't doing as well as they could have. If you look in the governor's race, this was actually a Republican-held governorship. Gretchen Whitmer defeats her opponent by nearly 10 points. So Michigan had some warning signs, to say the least, I would say. And even in 2014, Gary Peters still defeated his GOP opponent by a very large amount in a year that was the best year on record in the 21st century for the GOP. So honestly, looking at Michigan, there actually was some type of warning sign here. Even in the Senate race, which Gary Peters actually had a more tough race than Joe Biden, he still ultimately came ahead and won by 1.7%. It wasn't within the recount limit. It wasn't certified enough to be a recount. It wasn't as It wasn't as close as it was in 2016. So looking at Michigan, I think the warning signs were there, and looking at its electoral history, you may not have expected it to be close to the national average. But what we actually see is that some of these breakdowns by demographic group is actually just a complete reflection of what we saw on the national level. And also, I think that many of us could have predicted this just looking at the polling numbers as well. Joe Biden was up 8.4% in the national numbers, and can you guess what he was up in Michigan? Not 8.4%, but certainly close enough. 7.9%, a difference of 0.5%, actually underperforming Joe Biden, underperforming the margin on the national level in Michigan, but ultimately these were very close. I mean, the numbers were nearly spot on. The only state that was closer in terms of polling was actually Wisconsin, which was right on the money, but that ended up not being true. But Michigan, Michigan was very close to the national numbers. In fact, the closest out of any state in the 2020 election. So looking at Michigan, I think there's a lot more we can dive into. I'm not going to do that in just this video. It obviously is something that we can explore in the future. I just wanted to do a very surface level analysis of the state's electoral trend and what happened in the state that ultimately turned the state blue and what that meant for the national numbers, because some of them were very similar. In fact, almost identical to what we saw. And the initial polling numbers and the 2016 data might have indicated this straight from the beginning. But, you know, looking at Michigan's results ultimately ended up being the closest state comparable to the national popular vote. And there's a lot of insight here. There's a lot of analysis that really can dive into the state of Michigan that gives us a much better idea of why the entire country and why the Rust Belt voted in a certain way and ultimately turned away from President Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2020, post-2020 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.